to partner with you, Dr. Chaturvedi. And I want to finalize by thanking the government of the people of India. I'm here sharing the table with Ambassador Tirumurti, who is the chair in the Ministry of the IPSA Fund, the India, Brazil, South Africa Fund, established over 10 years ago, that has produced excellent initiatives in partnership between the three countries to assist other member states, and the more recent and extraordinary creation of the India UN Development Fund, led by Ambassador Akbaruddin. Thank you very much for the partnership and the confidence on our office, through which India has committed $150 million for South-South cooperation. So India is not only showing intellectual leadership through RIS, political leadership through the traditional work of your diplomacy, but also is committing resources to make South-South cooperation a reality. Thank you, and thank you to all the participants. And also thanks to the government of Argentina that will host the conference.
Yes, that's right, and we are glad that Ambassador is here. Thank you, Mr. Chadiak. Now I invite the Ambassador, Mr. Daniel Chabaru, for his remarks.
Thank you so much, Mrs. President-elect of the General Assembly, the organizers and good friends, Mr. Ambassador Kumar and Dr. Chaturvedi. It is a great pleasure for me to be here with you today in the inauguration of this space where all of us will debate in the framework of the Delhi process towards the VAPA Plus 40 conference. The forthcoming United Nations commemorative Buenos Aires Plan of Action conference will take place in my country in March of 2019. Will be a great opportunity to discuss and redefine the dynamics of South and triangular cooperation. Over the past years, we have witnessed an increased multilateral activity in which southern countries have demonstrated great dynamism and decision-making process at the global and regional level. Nevertheless, it is necessary to point out that the promotion of South-South and triangular cooperation should be done in a complementary way with traditional cooperation and its historical commitments regarding capacity building, transfer of technology, and provision of financial resources to developing countries. Thus, the second high-level UN conference on SSC will need that all development actors work together in order to redefine and rethink their functions and actions to face an objective that has become dynamic and multidimensional, such as sustainable development. On this regard, Argentina strongly believes that South-South cooperation has to play an important role in creating a new multilateralism and drive the achievement of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development. It is stressed that 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals constitute the major global political consensus of our time, which calls for analyzing the current model of development in all our nations. As we all know, since Nairobi Declaration, there has been a growing demand for an inclusive and more representative SSC governing platform, able to adapt global commitments to national capacities. Taking this context into account, Argentina supports the idea that the VAPA Plus 40 outcome should be one that launches a dynamic and continuous process able to collect the updates that arise around South-South cooperation and development. In this sense, the document to be adopted in Buenos Aires should be action-oriented and with a clear mandate for the future approach on the following objectives. First of all, institutional strengthening of South-South cooperation. Having a solid institutional platform for the management of SSC is the basis for an adequate development of cooperation projects. 2, promotion of a better regional and interregional articulation and synergies. Regional and interregional platforms are association schemes with great potential for building network, establishing of peer review mechanisms, and to coordinate positions in global forums. 3, promotion of triangular cooperation and strengthen mechanisms for joint implementation and shared governance. It must be ensured that it's based on the principle of the SSC and that the flexibility of this modality is not hindered by the confluence of different cooperation paradigms. Thus, it is necessary to address the triangular cooperation from an egalitarian construction between the parties, which is developed through a political dialogue and institutional coordination that allows the advent of a triangular cooperation with its own characteristics and entity, thus overcoming the traditional notion of same as marginal complement to bilateral cooperation among partner states. 4th, establishment of a global report about SS&T cooperation. Improving the quality of South-South and triangular cooperation information will contribute to assessing its potential for the achievements of the SDGs, while strengthening management, planning, and resource orientation processes. Progress should be made in instances like peer review mechanisms, and the cooperation countries of the South do not accept to be subjected to the same monitoring and responsibility that demands of the traditional cooperators. 5th, develop monitoring and evaluation systems focusing on impact as well as processes and allowing both quantitative and qualitative metrics. The absence of these mechanisms makes it impossible to have accurate and comparable information and data related to the contribution that this kind of cooperation made to development. 6, improve the coordination of South-South cooperation within the United Nations. UN system may assume a dual role, on one hand as a support platform for institutional construction and capacity building through projects and programs adapted to the specific needs of each developing country. On the other, it could be an ideal facilitator to promote synergies in South-South and triangular cooperation. We strongly believe that BAPA plus 40 will be a great occasion to reach a multilateral consensus that will allow international community to boost the quantity, reach, and quality of SS&T cooperation initiatives. That's why we invite the multiple actors of the international scenario to take part in this process and to make BAPA plus 40 the driving force in strengthening South-South cooperation. By further promoting multilateralism, regional integration, and collective pursuit of sustainable development. Argentina, as the chair of the conference, believes that it will be a unique opportunity to consider the lessons learned in the last 4 decades, to reach a deeper understanding of the BAPA message of 1978 in the current international context, and to promote new commitments that translate into final action-oriented document, into a final-oriented document capable of establishing an adequate and inclusive environment for the achievement of the 2030 agenda without leaving no one behind. Thank you so much to this daily process, and thank you for the organizers of the meeting for giving us this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Excellency. Now I have great pleasure in inviting Shri T.S. Tirumurti, Secretary, Economic Relations in Ministry of External Affairs.
Ambassador Dr. Mohan Kumar, Her Excellency Maria Fernanda Espinosa, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, distinguished dignitaries on the dais, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to attend the inaugural of the Delhi Process 4 on South-South and Triangular Cooperation as we celebrate the Buenos Aires Plan of Action's 40th anniversary. I felicitate the RIS for taking this important initiative. We are living in a world where everything is being reduced to monetary terms. For many developing countries, predictable financing is survival. Their commitment to meet their obligations flows from such financing being made available to them. Their commitment to their people for socio-economic development flows from such financing. That was being provided, though in a much reduced quantum of late, by the North. However, the North has suddenly taken note of, not all of it for altruistic reasons, what they see as the growing development cooperation between the global South. They see the need to reduce this South-South cooperation to monetary terms by following the same accounting and other templates that they are used to. And this is precisely where we have a problem. Growing South-South cooperation is becoming critical in bolstering the productive capacities of developing countries and has impacted the international developmental landscape positively. It has been able to act as the fulcrum around which several sustainable linkages beyond G to G as well have been made, whether in trade or investment or MSMEs or science and technology or in a range of other areas. Against these success stories of the global South, we have to juxtapose the growing reluctance of the North to shoulder its own financial and other responsibilities, which is becoming increasingly apparent when meeting the climate change obligations under UNFCCC or in assisting the realization of the SDGs. We are also not in favor of dilution of ODA or the growing emphasis on private funding whose motivations are quite different. In the face of such a situation, the global South has had to come up with its own paradigm, its own principles for South-South cooperation in order to clearly distinguish the two. Naturally, there is no single universal template for South-South partnership, and there should not be. Each country has its own priorities, and we need to fully respect that. For us, South-South cooperation is a manifestation of solidarity of the South to promote sustainability, national well-being, and self-reliance. Consequently, it is imperative that this cooperation is determined by the countries of the South, guided by the principles of respect for national sovereignty, national ownership and independence, equality, sharing, non-conditionality, demand-driven, non-interference in domestic affairs, and for mutual benefit. Accordingly, our approach to development cooperation has always been voluntary in nature. And in this compact, which I have just outlined, it goes without saying that when such development assistance results in indebtedness of a developing country or infringes on their sovereignty, then it cannot be South-South cooperation. India's approach has always been sensitive to the needs and requirements of our development partners and has never resulted in any indebtedness or disruption of their economies. Friends, foreign ministers of India, Brazil, and South Africa recently adopted IPSA Declaration on South-South Cooperation in Pretoria in June this year. This declaration enunciates key principles of South-South cooperation. Solidarity and spirit of sharing inter alia are listed as primary motivations. During his recent visit to Africa, in his address to the Ugandan Parliament, Prime Minister Modi outlined 10 guiding principles for our engagement with Africa, covering the entire gamut of our strategic partnership. These have generated tremendous enthusiasm among our African partners, and our development cooperation in Africa is one of the largest. Establishment of the BRICS New Development Bank and contingent reserve arrangement have been major achievements of the Global South towards global economic and financial governance. The pioneering IPSA Fund for Poverty and Hunger Alleviation, partnering the UN system, the UNOSCC, has met with success. It has been able to identify replicable and scalable projects in the fight against poverty and hunger and take up 27 projects in 15 developing countries. We have established the India UN Development Fund to take our South-South engagement even further. However, while we have the clamor from the North for bringing this growing South-South cooperation within their accounting and other templates, on the other hand, there is no movement to address the matter of reform of multilateral institutions and institutions of global governance to acknowledge this growing role of the Global South, especially in development partnership. In his meeting with BRICS leaders in South Africa last month, Prime Minister Modi pointed out that while we do not support the growing unilateralism and protectionist tendencies of the day, at the same time, we cannot go back to status quo on multilateralism and of the current international world order. He called for reformed multilateralism, around which the Global South can coalesce. Reform should go hand in hand with acknowledgement of the rising South. Therefore, friends, the discussion and debate you are having now has the potential to influence a much larger debate on the nature of multilateralism itself and the international order. While welcoming your efforts to flesh out the principles and build on the theoretical perspectives and empirical realities, I would guard against coming up with a well-meaning but restrictive template which may constrict rather than facilitate South-South cooperation. Kindly capture its diversity of forms, modalities, and practices. South-South cooperation has traditionally been an important pillar of India's foreign policy in development, defense and security, health, science and technology, education, etc. And through our iTech program, scholarships and fellowships, capacity building, lines of credit, grants, etc. It will only continue to strengthen as we reach out to our development partners in our neighborhood, Africa, the Arab world, small island states, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Triangular and South-South cooperation can only supplement international obligations to developmental assistance. India will be happy to partner countries if countries from North and other parts of the world wish to join in providing assistance to our developing country partners. The Prime Minister's initiative of the International Solar Alliance is an example of how South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation can coexist for a better world. To conclude, I'm happy to note that the network of Southern think tanks, NEST, which is housed at RIS, is also engaged in advancing South-South cooperation. I'm confident your consultations over the next 2 days will help to shape the Southern narrative and the approach to the second UN high-level conference on South-South cooperation, the BAPA plus 40 conference, taking place next March in Buenos Aires. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I must assure you that we would be working on different dimensions and the plurality and heterogeneity that South-South cooperation brings in. In fact, there is a full session on this very theme. I would also like to bring to your attention in the agenda, we have tried to capture this dynamics at the sectoral level. So agriculture, health, and development finance have been captured. Now, friends, the moment has come. I have great pleasure in introducing our esteemed speaker today to inaugurate this conference, Her Excellency Ms. Maria Fernando Espinazo Garcias, the President-elect of the 73rd session of the United Nations General Assembly. Before I invite her, I would request my chairman, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, to present her the bouquet of flowers from our side. She also met our civil society on Saturday at Delhi Heart, particularly those who are working on sustainable development goals. She has great interest in poetry, and she's an essayist. She has also contributed in strengthening Ecuador's civil society, and I here acknowledge the presence of the Ambassador of Ecuador here this morning. I now have great pleasure in inviting Her Excellency to address us with her inaugural address.
Well, good morning, Mr. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, Chairman of RIS, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, Director General of IRS, Mr. Jorge Chediak, Director of the UN Office of South-South Cooperation, Your Excellency Mr. Daniel Chuburru, Ambassador of Argentina to India, Mr. Sri Tirumurti, Secretary of the Ministry of External Affairs, Professor Amitav Acharya, Distinguished Professor of the American University, and allow me to also acknowledge the presence of the Permanent Representative of India to the United Nations, a dear friend, and also Ambassador Hector Cueva, Ambassador of Ecuador to India, and of course, good morning to all distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Let me, at the outset, start by thanking the government and the people of India for the hospitality and the warmest with which I have been treated since the very start of my stay in this beautiful country. I would also like to thank you, RIS, for the opportunity to speak today and to offer some general thoughts into both the importance of South-South and triangular cooperation, as well as the significance of the Buenos Aires Plan of Action 40 years later. We have to remember that 40 years ago, 138 countries came together to agree on a plan to share technical knowledge and enhance cooperation amongst developing countries. Throughout their goals was a desire to expedite and streamline development through shared knowledge, technology transfer, and joined up efforts to strengthen sustainable development. That's precisely the purpose of the Delhi process, to explore new avenues and challenges of South-South and triangular cooperation 40 years later in a very different political, social, and economic reality, as mentioned by previous speakers. At its core, the Buenos Aires Plan of Action was and remains an acknowledgement that achieving the well-being of humanity requires us to look beyond sectors or borders and to find common shared solutions. The second high-level conference on South-South cooperation, set to take place, as already mentioned, in March to mark the 40th anniversary of BAPA, is a critical moment to reflect and reinvigorate. In this, I mean that we must use this opportunity to reflect on the current status of South-South cooperation, particularly in the context of geopolitical and fiscal challenges, and to take action that helps revitalize the plan and the approach for a new era, allowing South-South and triangular cooperation to be a continued and trustworthy tool in achieving development objectives and, of course, help deliver on the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. While financing much of the Sustainable Development Goals will be a burden for developing countries, the impact of the financial crisis a decade ago still lingers. Nor is this the only global financial or political challenge to development aid or direct foreign investment. Enhanced South-South and triangular cooperation that is facilitated and encouraged at all levels will enable, for sure, countries to compensate for potential setbacks. Through mutual support and through strengthened regional trade, investment, and development, South-South cooperation can boost pre-existing efforts that may have slowed down or paved the way for new, otherwise unavailable opportunities. It is only by working together that we will ever eradicate extreme poverty, enhance access to health and education, and create economic opportunities for all, in order to, as mentioned by the ambassador of Argentina, to leave no one behind. South-South cooperation can make important contributions in this regard, helping countries undertake the necessary changes, institutional, structural, technological, or otherwise, then enable advancement. This is not to say that South-South cooperation should in any way replace North-South cooperation or development support. Rather, it is to note that our efforts are complementary in that they are only made more efficient and more effective when all potential angles for cooperation are pursued. As it is, many emerging markets have themselves passed through a similar development process to the one that many low-income and least developed countries are now undergoing. They have faced and face the same economic challenges in developing their infrastructure and human resources, in developing and diversifying their productive potential, and in achieving the structural transformation that is needed to ensure resilience against global pitfalls. Sharing lessons, experiences, technologies, and opportunities amongst our peers therefore only makes sense. I am pleased to say that countries such as India have emerged as leaders in this regard. An example, as already mentioned, is the India, Brazil, and South Africa Dialogue Forum, or IPSA, launched already in 2003. Focused on key areas such as energy, agriculture, transportation, and science and technology, IPSA seeks initiatives and processes that help to ensure sharing of knowledge, skills, technologies, and resources across the three partners. And just 2 weeks ago, India, along with its partners in BRICS, reaffirmed its commitments to sharing technologies, noting through their joint declaration that, and I quote, "It is essential to develop effective policies to bridge the digital divides, including through supporting people to learn and by adopting new technologies," end of quote. The declaration went on to emphasize that measures to ensure technology transfer must be in place. India is also a champion of the International Solar Alliance, launched last year by Prime Minister Modi and President Macron. The alliance had brought together dozens of countries to support energy access, create jobs, spur innovation, protect the environment, and enhance the market share of solar power. This, my friends, is the future of international cooperation. Colleagues, if we are to achieve the ambitions set out in Agenda 2030, then the aspirations of Buenos Aires and examples such as the ones I just mentioned must be continued, reinforced, and built upon. BAPA plus 40 is an opportunity to emphasize just this. We need ever stronger integration, coupled with the expansion of regional infrastructure, the building of equal South-South trading relationships, and greater regional policy coordination. As President of the UN General Assembly, I have committed to supporting the BAPA plus 40 process and will be embarking on an effort to reach out to member states and to produce a strong and meaningful outcome document by February 2019 that will boost cooperation, integration, solidarity as a means to transform lives and well-being of all. I look forward to ensuring success in Buenos Aires, and I wish you every success and a fruitful dialogue and conversation today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Your Excellency, for inaugurating the conference. I would now invite Professor Amitav Acharya for delivering the keynote address. Professor Amitav Acharya is UNESCO Chair for Transnational Challenges and Governance and Distinguished Professor at the School of International Services at American University in Washington. He was the first non-Western scholar to hold the position of the President of the International Studies Association in 2014 and 15. He was also the inaugural chair at the Tsinghua University in 16 and 18. So, Professor Amitav Acharya, you have the floor. Thank
you. Right. There is only about 15 minutes left before we have the tea break. So I would skip the pleasantries, but just thank RIS and for inviting me, and for Sachin to have faith in me as the keynote speaker. It's a very brave act on his part, and hope he doesn't get into any trouble for that. Because I may be the most out of place, hopefully not out of depth person in this room. I was counting how many people I know before I came, and there were 4, but I see Ambassador Akbaruddin. He and his minister, when he was spokesperson in the foreign ministry, we once shared a platform at my university here, Jawaharlal Nehru University, 4 or 5 years ago. But more importantly, most of you are development professionals or officials or experts. I am an academic who does very little, knows very little about development in the way you do. And also my specialization lately has been international relations theory. So after what your chairman said about theory, importance of theoretical, I'm even less encouraged and more nervous. I guess I'm here to put the South-South cooperation in a context, in the larger context of changing world or global order, and present to you a number of ideas which I've been playing with and for the last 10 years or so, to see whether they have any traction, any resonance with what you're trying to do in advancing South-South cooperation. And much of what I am going to talk about is in 2 books, which are actually briefly under the Multiplex, The End of American World Order, which is published 2014 and by Polity Press in Cambridge, and republished this year, and Constructing Global Order, which is just published by Cambridge this year, a couple of months ago. Some further details you can find much of that there, but also I have a policy relevant paper which I gave it to Dr. Sachin to circulate, and you can also find it in a journal called Ethics and International Affairs. First, how did we come here to the 20th century world and now 21st century world? So many of you have heard about the Great Divergence. Many of us take the rise of the West for granted, but it's a very short span in human history. So in the 18th century, China and India were the largest economies of the world. And so it's not even 500 years, it's 300 years or less since China and India went down with the rise of Europe, imperialism and colonialism. And at the end of the Second World War, China and India had fallen quite drastically. And during that time, the United States and the European countries plus Japan had taken off. So again, none of this data is perfect, but this is from Angus Madison, which is probably the most widely accepted data set on long-term global trends in economy. Now, of course, countries like China and India are rising. But I want to make a very important point that it's not just China and India. It's not just the BRICS, we give too much emphasis on BRICS and G20. The global south as a whole is rising. So I have done a lot of number crunching, not myself, but I actually surveyed a lot of databases on this. And I think what I'm presenting to you, which is also developed more clearly in my book, is what I consider as the consensus data or trends, that the global south or the developing countries will account for close to 60% of the global GDP by 2030. And by 2030, rise of China and India will probably account for 35% of global GDP, if not more. And also, if you look at how the tide is turning for the last, say, since the Chinese reforms actually started, followed by India's reforms. So look at the US-China share of global GDP. In 2001, US had 32% of the global GDP. China had only 4%. So US share, America's share, was almost 8 times that of China. In 2014, the United States had fallen to 22.3%. China had risen to 13.4%. So US share of the GDP was only 1.7 times that of China. Now, again, take all this data with a pinch of salt because they can vary. But generally, there is no question about where the world is heading. And many of you are economists here, and you would know much better, much more specific information on this. But I think based on, I have surveyed a whole range of data, including UN data as well, and I find that this is, to me, unless something really dramatic happens, we see not only the rising powers of 4 or 5 countries or 20 nations, but the rise of the global south in general. So the 5 largest economies in terms of share of global GDP could be China, the United States, the European Union, India, Japan, and again, China and India could account for 35% of the world's GDP, which would restore them to their position at the beginning of the 18th century. So it's not really new in the larger scale of history. Okay, moving on. What does this mean for world order? So this power shift we are looking at, what does it mean for world order? Well, to put it very crudely in a stylized way, the post-World War II period, many people call it bipolar, but it's a misnomer. Really, there was a very unipolar. The Soviet Union was only important in a military, strategic, and to some extent ideological sense. But overall, preponderance of power laid with the United States. And it was the United States that shaped institutions of multilateralism, and also, including the big multilaterals, the UN system, and also had a tremendous influence on the foreign policies of states and regions, including non-state actors, by the way. Many of the non-state actors, even though they challenged the authority of governments, including that of the United States, but the large, big NGOs came mainly from the United States or were backed by the West, and also corporations, which are also, I consider, as non-state actors. They were also dominated by the United States. So the United States has this overarching dominance, where some people call it American primacy, some people call it American hegemony, or the liberal order, liberal hegemonic order, which is much in the news these days for its decline and possibly end. Today's world, as we see, is very different, looking increasingly different. And that world has United States as a key player, but not in the hegemonic position. We had the old powers, including the European powers like France, Britain, and Germany, United States, but we also have rising powers like China, India, and the BRICS countries in general. But they do not control the world in the way the United States control the world. So they have a small portion, the small semicircle you see. They are important. The world is still hierarchical. I don't believe the world is flat. We're going to see a very equal world. It's going to be hierarchical, but the nature of that hierarchy is going to change. And we have more space for institutions and multilateralism, and I'll come to that in a moment. These are not going to be the same institutions and multilateralism that we had after World War II. There will be new institutions, new forms of multilateralism, very, very different than the last 60 years or so. And then we have nations and regions and non-state actors playing an increasingly important role and impact a foundational role in the global order. So I call it the multiplex world. So you will see this is a slightly different representation of the previous chart. You see a lot of linkages. It's a complicated, complex picture. It's not straight unipolarity or hegemony or bipolarity. It's not even multipolarity. In fact, I discard the term multipolarity, and I'll tell you in a moment. What I call a multiplex world, or MGO, which kind of rhymes nicely with a lot of development concepts, is a world without a hegemon. There will be no dominant power in the way Britain and then the United States were. Culturally, politically diverse. Diversity is not going to go away. The world is not going to be flat. We will have strong diversity among countries, among regions, but at the same time, functionally interdependent. Interdependence is not going to go away either. And interdependence, if anything, is much more complex than it was in the pre-Second World War period. Today, we have interdependence not just in trade, but finance, production networks, supply chains, and global issues like climate change. That's not going to go away. The main players will not be just states, both the makers and breakers, but also, or not just even great powers, but also non-state groups, corporations, people's movements, especially empowered by social media, and where cooperation will occur along multiple but cross-cutting layers and issues. So I liken it to a multiplex cinema, which gives this audience a choice of several movies, several actors, directors, producers, and plots, rather than going to the old age, 1950s or 60s, single movie theater, wait for a movie to go away, finish its run to see a new movie. It's more like a multiplex theater or Netflix or streaming. You have the audience have a lot more choices of who are the actors, who are the producers, and what are the plots. There is no return to traditional multipolarity. Multipolarity only talks about the distribution of power, how many good big actors are there. But it doesn't talk about the quality of the relationship among them. So multipolarity is one element of multiplex. Multiplex is a much more overarching concept where you have the quality of relationship, interdependence. The types of actors is not just great powers, as in multipolarity, but also a variety of non-state and other actors. As I mentioned, no global hegemony, persisting cultural and political diversity, and global governance, which is about multilateral institutions, is much more fragmented. It's already happened, by the way. Well before Trump, multilateralism has been fragmenting. The UN and the big multilaterals are not the only game in town, and I have done a lot of studies myself on this to see very complex processes, regional organizations, for example, but also corporations like Gates Foundation in global health, public-private partnerships or triangular relationships among different countries, but also among different types of actors, not just among governments. That is already happening for the last 30 years or so, especially in issues like climate change and human rights. Globalization is likely to be less led by West, as it has been for the past 200 or 300 years, but more by the rest. And there may be a greater focus on a more equitable, just world, but I'm not so sure. So the multiplex world will look like this in terms of actors. You have new institutions like the BRICS or groups and G20. You have the United Nations. You have regional organizations and interregional relationships. You have private actors or corporations. And then you will also have issues like climate change. You have terrorists and refugees and migration. It's going to be very messy and unclear. Complexity is going to be the name of the game. And more on justice and multiplex, this issue of ethics and international affairs. They put together an article of mine after liberal hegemony with Amartya Sen's Ethics and the Foundation for Global Justice. And I think you will see where ethics and global justice will feature in. I have a feeling, despite all the inequality we see today, because of the rise of the rest, the international development agenda, a global governance agenda, will increasingly have to embrace more and more issues of justice and ethics. So South-South linkages in this world, many trends point to the importance of South-South linkages. For example, South-South trade in goods, which is now over a quarter of the total goods flows. not manufacturing I'm talking about here, not services. South-South FDI flows now are about a third of global flows, and this is UNCTAD data. The largest outward investing economies in 2015 were Brazil, China, Hong Kong, of course, part of China, India, Republic of Korea, Malaysia, Mexico, Singapore, South Africa, and Taiwan. 2015, multinational enterprises, this is investment from developing Asia became the world's largest investing group for the first time, accounting for almost a third of the total. Investments by Chinese multinational enterprises grew faster than inflows into China, reaching a new high of 116 billion in 2015. And China spends more on economic infrastructure annually than North America and Western Europe combined. So what it means is that globalization, despite the concerns expressed after Trump's election, is not going to be to die or go away. It will just take a different form and different phase. It will be led by multiple actors, including China and India, not just the West, based more on South-South linkages rather than traditional North-North or North-South linkages, less political conditionality, especially when these actors like China and India become more important in the global investment scenario. Broader agenda, it will focus more on development. To me, infrastructure is part of development as opposed to trade, although all are linked. And I am hoping that it will be less coercive. It will not be free from conflicts, nothing ever is, but it will not be unlike the scale of the past European or American use of force. Globalization came on the back of imperialism, in case you have forgotten. I'm sure you haven't. And it was fairly coercive in its foundation. And we're hoping that with the rise of the rest, that element of coercion will decline. What about the leadership? People talk about G7, G8, G1, G2, G20, G77, you all know that. But there are people also, Western academics and policy analysts talk about a G0 world. Because the United States is declining leadership, there's a leadership vacuum. People like Ian Bremmer, for example, talk about. I actually think we'll see what is called a G+ world. Because of the number of actors proliferating, number of issue areas proliferating, we will see very complex forms of cooperation and leadership at different levels, and also regional, local, global level, inter-regional level, and also depending on issue areas. No country is going to lead in every issue area. So the European Union leads in the climate change, we know that. The United States still will be a big leader in military affairs, strategic affairs. China will have increasing importance, leadership in economic, and especially certain aspects of development agenda. So we will see also leadership at the regional level. You cannot think about leadership in Southeast Asia without ASEAN, because ASEAN plays a very important role despite all of the problems it's facing today. So leadership will be entrepreneurial, intellectual, structural, and also normative. So what I would now conclude with is what I call idea shift. We have talked about power shift. Everybody talks about changing GDP. I started by talking about that, how the GDP structure, the share of global GDP is changing. But we don't talk about corresponding shift in ideas. We still think most of the good ideas come from the West, and the rest basically follows with some tinkering. Sometimes good people from the global South propose good ideas, like Amartya Sen on Mahabubul Haq on human development, Francis Deng on responsible sovereignty, or the late Wangari Maathai of Kenya on sustainable development. But we think that they all trained in the West. Mahabubul Haq and Amartya Sen studied in Cambridge, and Wangari Maathai in Pittsburgh, and Francis Deng studied in Yale. I've studied a whole bunch of these what I call idea shifters. So people say, oh, this is all Western training. But one of the things I found when I did a study, which will be also part of a book, but there is a paper already in Third World Quarterly called Idea Shift. You can look at it. I found overwhelmingly, when they develop a new idea, they reject the Western idea that trained them. Overwhelmingly. They find that the training was almost useless. Muhammad Yunus, who got Nobel Prize for microfinance, Peace Prize, he came back to Bangladesh, and he writes in his autobiography, there was a famine in his hometown. He said, all my knowledge is useless, because how do you get these people money when they cannot have a collateral? Even his Bangladeshi banks won't lend him money. So he developed ideas based on the local context. Mahabubul Haq developed human development looking back at the situation in Pakistan, and Amartya Sen has talked about it. He was a refugee from partition India, almost died, his family almost perished during the partition, and he lived with the Pakistani political experiment between swinging between civilian and political rule. Francis Deng was with the OAU and African Union, then of course the UN Secretary General's representative for internally displaced persons. A lot of his ideas came from Africa. The idea of responsible sovereignty is an African contribution, as Mohammad Sanoun, the co-chair of R2P Commission, said. Because it was Thabo Mbeki, it was the African leaders after the Somalia 1992 debacle, realized that the West doesn't care. So they have to take matters into their own hands, because the West cares more about Balkans than about the Great Lakes, for example. And if you look at it carefully, where this idea of responsible sovereignty came from, mostly it was an African innovation. Of course, it had other contributors, but I consider it, as Mohammad Sanoun would do, as an African contribution to human rights and humanitarian intervention, because they championed. It was the change from African OAU to African Union, and the fact that it is the only regional organization, AU, whose constitutive act includes a specific clause providing for humanitarian intervention and against genocide and large-scale atrocities, tells you that Africa played a very important role. So all I'm saying is you can find such ideas in climate change, also in CBDR, common but differentiated responsibility. So let me just conclude very quickly then by saying that an idea shift is occurring. It's not as visible and as fast as the global power shift, because we don't capture them, not because the ideas are not there. We don't capture them. We still study ideas in terms of where they were finally presented. So if there is a Geneva Agreement, or I love the UNDP, but UNDP did not create the human development idea, although it was the first articulation of the idea, implementation of that idea came from UNDP. But the idea came from the scholars, Mahabubul Haq and Amartya Sen, who were classmates in Cambridge. And a lot of that reflected their own background. Amartya Sen, the case of Bengal famine, for example. So responsible sovereignty, Francis Deng coined the term among a few others, but the Canadian-sponsored commission, R2P Commission, articulated it. So maybe the final articulation point of articulation of ideas are still in the West, although I hope that will change. Maybe the Delhi process will come up with ideas we can associate with the location. But the work, the thinking, and the context from which these ideas are done are overwhelmingly from the Global South. And that's what matters, and we have to capture that with a new set of lenses, new set of conceptual tools. Also, very important, as I said, these ideas are not necessarily coming from the BRICS, with due respect. They are coming from all over. Pakistan, Bangladesh, microfinance, Kenya, Wangari Maathai. I went to do my field work with her Greenbelt movement. It's amazing how ideas come from where. In fact, they come from the most unfortunate places in some cases, not from the settled and wealthy cities or countries of the world. But also important, and this is particularly important when you're talking about triangular cooperation. I only got to know about this a few days ago. There's such a thing. But I had thought exactly along those lines that in the old days, the ideas from the Global South were mainly about rejection and resistance, fairly so, anti-colonial struggles, non-alignment, new international economic order. They were resisting existing paradigms and policy frameworks. But ideas increasingly, and they have legacy. I'm not saying that are gone away, non-alignment or neo or colonial struggles, anti-colonial struggles, they still have legacy. But increasingly I find in my survey of global ideas that they are more forward-looking, more problem-solving, not about resistance, but about solving problems. So ideas such as human security, human development, responsible sovereignty, they offer forward-looking vision. And they do also allow for not only South-South, but also North-South partnership. And this is where your triangular cooperation is very, very important, because you cannot dismiss the North, because it still has most of the institutions and outlets for knowledge creation and dissemination. So what I see as North-South, South-South, and South-North flow of ideas and synergy. And at the same time, Western principles and pathways of development, security, governance, and ecology, which offered in the beginning a very poor fit for the non-Western world, are being altered, localized, and new ones developed out of a global South context. So let me stop here. As I said, I have a number of articles and books on this, including one published in China recently, and I invite you to take a look at them. And thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thanks, Amitav. Thanks a lot. And I'm so glad that I decided to invite you. I'm so glad that you delivered the first address after Her Excellency inaugurated the conference. And I'm so glad that you said, with rise of the rest, coercion would decline in the process of globalization. And that's why, Amitav, I feel South has to go for theorization of South-South cooperation. We can't be talking in channels and platforms where only governments interact. It is important that academics rise up to the occasion and respond to the heft that is required in the academic institutions, and we take the ideas of Western literature and Western theories, and as you rightly said, the power is shifting towards East. But is East academic prepared with their own explanation of the phenomenon? What Secretary Tirumurti very rightly said, non-monetized approach. So do we have non-monetized approach? I'm so glad that some of the examples that you gave are extremely clear, that we do not pick up the ideas. Somebody who is sitting right in front, and my predecessor at RIS, Dr. Nagesh Kumar, came up with this idea of why it is important for FDI to have performance clause. But how many people are picking that up? Are we picking up that in our policy frameworks? That's where South doesn't celebrate South's own knowledge. And this, I think, is important. The UN agencies, Madam Excellency, under your leadership this year, as we celebrate BAPA plus 40, are expected, and I'm sure you would give a major fillip to this idea of knowledge creation within the South and providing a traction that the process requires. If BAPA plus 40 report, Mr. Chadwick, is again to be written by consultants from the North, I do not want a consultancy, but I'm saying that you should give chance to Southern scholars and Southern agencies who are not based in New York, who are not part of your usual network. So please bring in the scholars from the Nest, scholars from the South, and as Amitav very rightly said, bring in this knowledge up in terms of global sort of consideration. I'm very glad, Amitav, that I decided to invite you. Thanks for your address. Your book is on display outside. Those of you who want to purchase, it's there. I would also like to acknowledge now the presence of our director from South Center, which is one of the important institutions and partner with us, Carlos Correa, who is an important authority from the South on intellectual property rights. So thanks a lot. I also acknowledge young participants at our iTech course, Madam Excellency. We have 33 participants from 24 countries, and they are here discussing with us the idea of sustainable development goals. So friends, with this, we come to an end of this session. We would have 15 minutes tea break and would be back here at 11:45. Thank you.
लोगों का आ रहा है?
हाँ अभी तो आया,
कितने लोगों का आया है?
अभी 1 2 3 लोगों का।
किस सेशन के लिए?
एक था उस सेशन के लिए जो चला गया, इस सेशन के लिए सिर्फ एक आया है,
कौन सा है?
मोहंती जी का। उसके बाद और पता कर लीजिएगा, आप जानते हैं ना कौन कौन है।
Second presentation.
Yes, which one? Which session?
The Esteves.